Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our webinar titled An Overview of TOGAF and Relation between TOGAF and ITIL. This is Rania Al-Maghrabi speaking, and I'm honored to introduce our speaker for this webinar, Mr. Tom Van Sante from the Netherlands. Tom is Program Director and the Principal Consultant at KPN Consulting Company in the Netherlands. Tom is the elected representative for supplier members on the Open Group's governing board. He's also going to give you a hint about himself at the beginning of his presentation. I'm happy today to say that it's actually remarkable that we have registrants for this webinar from several countries, majority being from Egypt, but we also have attendees from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from Jordan, Kuwait, Sudan, UAE, and we have one registrant from each of Canada, Germany, United States, and the Netherlands. This webinar is scheduled for 1 hour, including questions and answers. You are encouraged to raise any questions you may have during the webinar by posting it in the chat area available to you, and we'll try to allocate time at the end of the presentation so that the speaker can answer any questions you may have. So now I leave you with the presentation, and I'm sure you'll find it very useful and informative for you. So please, okay, Tom, we are listening to you. Please start.
Okay, I'll start. And it's very helpful to see that Ashraf from Canada is so now and then giving me some feedback if the sound is good from my microphone, because we had some trouble in the introduction of Rania in the beginning. But let us start. We have the first slide on, and as you can see, I'm a board member of the Open Group. And the Open Group is the organization, just like more or less like ITSMF, that is involved in the development of different sort of standards, as we say, standards to support the boundary-less information flow. One of them is TOGAF. It stands for the Open Group Architectural Framework. What I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about it and give you some insights in how I look at TOGAF and the relationship with ITIL. Because to begin, maybe it's handy to say something about myself. I've been working in IT for a little bit more than 30 years now. Before doing that, I studied architecture at the Technical University in Delft, which is in the Netherlands. So basically I'm, what you can say, an architect. But not an IT architect, I'm a building engineer. From that time I started working in IT because buildings weren't made that often in the Netherlands in those days. And I started to work for a company called Pink Elephant, which is a company known for introducing ITIL to the Netherlands and to Europe. What we've did is we developed several books on ITIL and written them for the ITIL organization, the CCTA in England. And next to that, we started, or after that, we started to develop other standards that have been presented to you as well. The ones were called ASL and BISL, which is basically based on ITIL, but more focused on application service management and on functional application service management to end users. What I did too is I was also involved in writing some of those ITIL books, and I've written some books on standards. And as you can see down on the slide, I've written a book called TOGAF, a Management Overview. And that was in the time that I got involved in the Open Group, because from ITIL we slowly moved towards standards that are more concerned with architecture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. So now you have an idea what's my background and what my interests in ITIL and TOGAF are. What I want to do with you is talk a little bit about how I look at the world and how it's changed in the years past us, and why architecture is getting more and more important. And then I'll focus a little bit on TOGAF and give some information on what TOGAF versus ITIL is, and then we end up with a wrap-up. It will take some 45 minutes probably, maybe a little less, but we'll see. Well, if we look at the world around us, and I just said I started working in IT some 30 years ago, things have dramatically changed. We've seen a lot of technology coming at us, and the globalization in the world has shaken us up, and organizations are changing according to it. They get more and more competition, they merge, they buy other companies, they try to get better in their economy of scale. Some things were turned to commodities, people are outsourcing things, we're offshoring. There's a lot happening, and if you look at that, you could say that companies face new business demands. We're getting agile, we have to be adaptive, we have to be predictable, transparent, justified and controlled, and that's not easy. But basically, if you look at it, IT didn't change that much. It's only gone faster and more, because when we started with IT, I remember we only registered some data in databases, and they were not much more than digital examples of what we used to do on paper. But when we did that, quite soon we figured out that we were not the only ones who did that. The other departments in our company did the same. And when we checked on them, we found out that they were using the same information, and sometimes a little bit different. Their customers and the addresses their customers had were slightly written different, so it was hard to integrate. But we had to do that because all these parts of the companies had to work together. And then the marketing department came and they started to work with internet. You saw new IT organizations develop in organizations that were doing nothing but internet, instead of working together with the back end of our companies, where all the data of our customers and our products and our stuff is. So then we had to link that together, because in the front side and the websites we started to ask questions and we wanted to automatically answer them. And it's gotten even worse, because on the front side it's not only internet, it's we're interacting safely, that is, with telephones, tablets, and everyone on the internet is linking to our company. And now we see ourselves linked into supply chains, and we're working in the cloud, and everything is linked together. It's basically not changed, but it's more and more and more, and it's getting more and more complex. So what you see is all organizations are struggling with this complexity of the numbers, and they're all trying to figure out how to plan the future so that investments they make are not lost by the time they pay for them. And that's why there's a growing interest in architecture. But the problem with architecture is that the growing interest for that has grown together with the different ideas about the word architect and architecture. Not everyone has the same meaning for it. So what I'd like to do with you, have a small look from the mind of a building architect, because when I started architecture, I got pictures like this in front of me, and my professor would say, have a look at the picture on one. And probably no one knows what that is, but it's a building built by Frank Lloyd Wright. And what the professor would tell us is, have a look at the beauty of the architecture of the surrounding, how it lingers together or mingles together with the architecture of the building. And no one in the audience would ask, Professor, can you tell me, what do you mean by architecture? And when I was walking around in New York together with my wife and kids, and I would say to them, have a look around at the beautiful architecture you see. And no one of them would ask me, Father, what do you mean by architecture? And that has to do with the fact it's a vague and strange word. It even goes further. In the building world we have permit requests or even specifications. And they're used in building architecture. And still, it's hard to pinpoint what architecture exactly is. There is a standard for that. And it says, architecture is the fundamental organization of a system embodied in its components, their relationship to each other and the environment, and the principles governing its design and evolution. But that doesn't make it very clear, does it? Because what I ask myself, is architecture the result, or is it the description I see, or is it the process to get there? And that's probably the biggest problem in architecture. I still think an architecture is a vague and a strange concept. So beware of the unclarity that it brings, because we IT folks, so now and then use the word architecture for design instead of for planning the future. It's much more. I never started studying architecture to make architecture. The only thing I wanted to do is, I wanted people to realize beautiful buildings or cities, and I wanted to do that by using models and descriptions to reduce the complexity in order to help them bridge the gap between dream and reality. All of that within the borders of law and technical possibilities. So that's what architecture actually is. If you look at what Gardner says about it, they are even more vague than I am. They have a description of what an organization does. It says something in the blue signs you see there. There's something like governance on a company, and the company has a vision. It makes himself an enterprise architecture, and that supports the portfolio management that then has to be engineered and sourced. And there has to be some sort of implementation and migration and some exploitation and improvement during the time it's used. But the gray field you see over there, that's what Gardner sees as the architect domain. And on the bottom you see what architects have to do. In the beginning they do something that's very vague. You see that strange scribbling kind of line in the bottom, and it says architects facilitate decisions, and it's not so very clear what they mean by what is it exactly they do. But at a certain moment they formalize decisions. They make the decisions in detailed forms so that the organization can work with them, and then they control the decisions. This is what Gardner says architecture is. In my opinion, you could say, listening to what I just said, it is called architecture when an architect uses architecture to create architecture. So for me, it's not only the result, it's also the process. Something that describes how you get there. And that's something TOGAF does. I'll come back to that soon. And you can use drawings and documents and everything you can use to explain your constituents how you see the world around you, how you can explain the difficulties to get somewhere, to get to the result, because that's the only thing that counts. Well, let's have a look at TOGAF in the Open Group. I just said I'm a board member in the Open Group, and the Open Group is a global organization that works vendor neutral on making actually standards to help organizations work together in chains so that they cross the gaps of their own organization in order to have IT work together. So our mission is we drive the creation of the boundaryless information flow. And our strategy is that we work with customers and suppliers and consortia and other standard bodies to make new standards, to make services to our members, to help them interact digitally to others. In the Open Group there is an architecture forum, and its focus is mainly on TOGAF. They do other things as well. They have a focus on the profession of architects. So they help in developing this standard, the Open Group Architectural Framework, which is TOGAF, and they help educate architects in how do you do that. And they do something on architectural tools. One of those tools is called Archimate. It's a language to describe architectures with. And you can use it in line with TOGAF. So what is TOGAF? If you look at the word itself, it has some information in it. It's open, it's free of charge, it's transparent, and it's available. So what you could say is TOGAF has a lot in common with standards like ITIL. Just like ITIL, you can download it, you can use it. And it's based on consensus of different organizations, not only users, but also governmental organizations or companies that make money by training others in TOGAF or in other open group standards. So it's a collection of people who work together to make this standard. So let's focus on what is TOGAF then. The original most famous part of TOGAF is called TOGAF 8, and I'll be getting into TOGAF 9 a little bit further on. TOGAF 8 has 3 core elements, and these core elements are still there in TOGAF 9. On the left you see we have an iterative step-by-step approach to build an enterprise architecture. And that says, and it's called the Architectural Development Method, ADM. I'll get into that a little later. And I'll explain a little bit more about what we mean by an architect, an enterprise architect. Then we do have something called the enterprise continuum. We in the open group and the developers of TOGAF, we think that most of the elements you use in architectures are already designed by others or thought about by others. So the best thing you can do is reuse. So we have a virtual repository of reusable building blocks in making architectures that helps us not to reinvent the wheel. So the enterprise continuum is a very strong concept in that. And next to that, we have something that ITIL people know as well. We have resource-based, filled with best practices for things like what is an architecture board, or what is architecture compliance, or how do you work with architecture contracts, or how do you do architectural governance. What are views, principles, skills, and other things. Actually, the sort of things you can find in the ITIL best practices as well. Well, let us then focus a little bit more on the ADM, because it said something about we develop an architectural, an enterprise architecture for a company. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, you start with a phase called the preliminary phase. You have to prepare the organization for a successful architectural process. And here I'd like to ask you to think about a building architect. Imagine you have a small house and you want to enlarge it, and you invite an architect to come and tell you how to help you to do that. The first thing you'll ask him is, tell me a little bit about yourself, and are you capable of doing this? Are you the one I need? In this case, IT architects have to talk to their management and explain them that there's probably a problem ahead, and try to convince them that they have to use an architect to solve this problem. So this is probably the most important part of architecture in our modern day lives, because often architects begin doing things without having people that asked them to do that. So architects have to find the people with the problem. And then the next thing is, if they have a contract of doing something, we have a phase A, and that says we have to decide about the scope and manage the expectations. on what am I going to do this architecture. How big is the problem we're going to solve? What's the current state of our organization and where do we want to be? Is it only IT we're going to do, or is it also organizational? Because in the phases next to that, we have a phase B, and it says develop the business architecture, including the state we're in and the place we want to be after a certain time. We call it the east and the zoll of the transition. So the organization has to change. But if the organization has to change, you also have to know what sort of applications have to change accordingly. Because sometimes the software we use isn't applicable for the organization we need tomorrow. So we have to change the software as well. And we have to decide where are we now, where do we want to be, and what's the best road to get there. And we have to do the same thing on the technology used for the information systems to run on to support the business. So in this area we have to do the real work of figuring out where are we, where do we want to be, and how do we get there. It's something that's linked to the ITIL continuous improvement, but it's far more in-depth described in the TOGAF ADM. Once you know that, you come to a phase that says we can identify the most important implementation products. Do we have the money to do that? Is everyone agreeing on where we have to go to? And then you get the decision, I'm not right, we just have to go to the center. I forgot to say that. While doing this, we constantly focus on a part in the center, which is called requirements management. Once I figure out that there is no software for our future state, sometimes I have to go back to the drawing board and have to decide, maybe I have to change the organization a little bit different. So by doing that, we can iteratively walk from business architecture to information system architecture to technology architecture and back. So we keep that in mind while looking at the requirements management. But now we've figured it all out, we get to a phase that's called phase F. We basically plan what sort of actions we have the money for to execute. And then we execute it and take care that everything is done according to what we've decided and described. And as a phase H called, if something happens in the future that makes us decide that our cycle has to be run again, then we have to readjust the architecture to the enterprise we are now. So we do the cycle of the ADM another time. Simplified, you could say, there is a phase called getting the organization committed and involved. There's a step, get the architecture right, gather all the information you need, and then you go to the third phase, make the architecture work, and there's a fourth phase that says keep the process running. Because we want to go from the baseline to the target, and the most important steps we have to take are the steps in between. We have a business information and technology architecture baseline, we have a target. The projects and milestones in between, they decide whether we get to the future. Then we look at TOGAF 9. And what I've just told you normally is being told in a week. So I can imagine I did go a little bit fast. But what we've seen now is that on the left top you see the ADM, which is the same as in TOGAF 8. On the bottom you see in the middle Enterprise Continuum, which is something I just said is a continuum of reusable building blocks. I won't go into that into detail, and we have some reference model on the top right. And then in TOGAF 9 we got some new components that were linked to that. We got some extra guidelines and techniques of how are we going to cycle through this ADM and do all these steps, because sometimes you understand what it has to be done, but you want to know how you have to do it. So the ADM guideline and techniques tell you a little bit more about how to do that. And in the middle top you see something that's new in TOGAF 9 as well, which is called Architecture Content Framework. Once you've made all these descriptions and all these support to help your management make decisions, you have to pin them down. Like the Gardner guy said, you have to formalize the architecture, and you're going to put it into a content framework. Everything you describe on your organization, you can put that in a content framework. Sometimes it's automated and sometimes it's by hand, but it's something that has a stamp on it. This is how we do the things we do today. And on the bottom right you see something called Architecture Capability Framework, which is something that helps us organize the processes around doing architecture. So it means we have to educate our people, we have to have processes from management to the floor, we have to have governance on architecture in place, all kind of things needed to do architecture on a good way. And this, the combination of all these things, is called, this is the way we do an enterprise architecture in our company. If you have done all this, if you have the process of the ADM in place, you have guidelines and techniques knowing how to do that, you have reusable building blocks, you have a filled architecture content framework, reference models, and a capability framework, then you're into the business of enterprise architecture. So let us now have a little look at TOGAF and ITIL, because most of what I said is very common to people who are used to ITIL, but ITIL came from a different background. We used to be working with processes that helped us service users. That was in the beginning, but when organizations changed, we found out that users of tomorrow are different from the users of today. So we had to think, as ITIL people, as service managers, we had to think about the future as well. And so you see that from ITIL 1 to ITIL 2 to ITIL 3, ITIL has evolved as well. So parts in ITIL are looking at architecture, are figuring out what is the future going to bring us, and how do we have to adjust ourselves to that. But being precise about it, you could say TOGAF came more from a strategic part of the organization, where they face more and more that their dreams never reached the tactical and the operational level, so they figured out how to do that. The ITIL people came from the operational level and figured out that changing for the future needed more tactical and strategic insight. So this is more or less how you can see that TOGAF and ITIL worked together to form a continuum where they both are in. If you have a look at the details of it, and you can download a white paper on that by incident was written by me, you can see that if you look at the colors, both areas of interest are sometimes the same. So service strategy in ITIL is addressing the same sort of questions as people from the architecture field would do in the preliminary framework and principles in the architecture vision. And that goes for all the other colors, as you see down there as well. There are different areas where people who work in the ITIL world have to think about the same questions that the people who work in the architecture world. So the question is now, what makes ITIL and TOGAF different then? Why isn't it the same? Why isn't it interlinked? Well, the differences are actually that we have to remember that ITIL was based on service management. So even if you think about the future and you help your management reach that future, you still have to keep in mind that your basic primary focus should be service management. And on the other hand, the enterprise architects have to know and remember that their area of expertise is still enterprise architecture. So they are not the operational guys. They can not tell the operational guys you have to change this or that. They only can help in getting inside information or focus or ideas about how to do that. So what you often see is instead of working next to each other, it would be very good to put people from the ITIL world, service managers and enterprise architects, into the same room when they are thinking about the future. Because basically they can answer the same questions, and after they leave the room, they can use these answers to fill in the requirements for their own good. So the ITIL guys will go back to focus on the service management development to the future, and the enterprise architecture guys will go back to the development of the organizational functions, for instance. So there are a lot of subjects they can address together, each from their own perspective. And the funny thing is, when I wrote this white paper, I was invited by a bank somewhere in England. I won't say the name of it. And they said, "You're totally right. Please come and tell us your story about the overlap between ITIL and TOGAF." And I said, "Well, I'm willing to do that." So I came to London to tell them a story about it. And when I started, I asked who's here from the IT department, who's a service manager, and who are enterprise architects. And to my astonishment, there were only architects over there, which basically figures or pinpoints the problem we have here. These two areas, although they have grown together into a common interest, they still work without each other. And but maybe the fact that I'm telling this story here to the ITSMF in Egypt has to do with the fact that both ITIL people and TOGAF people know that these two worlds are getting more and more together and belong to each other. So I did it very quickly. But I hope if you listen to me another time again by listening to the tape, you understand what I mean. Thanks for listening, and I've said some on the bottom of this sheet. Is there anyone who wants to ask me something? Are there any questions? We still have a small 15 minutes left. Something like that. Who would like to ask me something? And please have a look, of course, at the TOGAF website and especially the Architecture Forum website within the Open Groups website. There's a lot of information over there, and as I said, I tried to give you an overview of something that's normally done in several days, so have a look over there. I see I get a question here from Hani Ammar from the United States, stating I'm still vague about the more in-depth, yeah, differences between ITIL and TOGAF. Uh, well, there are two different frameworks, and actually, one is based on service management, and the other one is based on enterprise architecture, which is a different angle to view at it. I suppose